If you're the kind of person who uses Microsoft Excel and you use the if function, but every time you do it ends up looking like some sort of nested monstrosity, then this is the video for you. We're going to cover 3 great alternatives to nested if statements that are quicker to write, easier to read, and just make your workbook look neater. But first, in case you're new here, hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Elliot and I make videos all about Microsoft Excel. Over the past few years, I've gone from beginner to reaching the final 32 in last year's Microsoft Excel World Championship. This year, I'm hoping to make it all the way to the Grand Finals live in Las Vegas. So make sure you subscribe to the channel because I'm sharing everything I'm doing to prepare, as well as everything I've learned on the way, so that we can excel together. Every Excel user at some stage starts chaining together if statements like there's no tomorrow. And there's no shame in this, it gets the result you want and it works. However, they can be hard to read, particularly if you're giving the workbook to someone else, or if you're coming back to it after a few months and have misplaced documentation. So today we're going to cover 3 great alternatives using some of the newer functions in Excel that make this a whole lot easier. To do this today, we're going to explore a data set consisting of 30 Pokémon. For each of the Pokémon we know their name, we know their type, we know their number of hit points, and we know various battle attributes, their attack, their defense, and their speed. From this, we want to create 3 custom fields where we would typically use nested if statements. If we take a look at this data more closely, we can see I've laid out the criteria for assigning these 3 categories over to the right of the table. For example, Excel's verses will be grass if it's bug and dragon if it's dragon, and so on. For figure, we calculate the category based on the hit points compared to these boundaries here. And finally, for the battle form, we compare the speed, attack, and defense against a set of criteria to assign a Pokemon that the Pokemon fights most like. If we want to calculate which type they excel against, then the nested if version might look something like this. You take an if statement and you compare the type against a certain type, and if it is that type, you know what to return. If not, you move on to the next if statement. For example, if it's bug, grass, if it's dragon, dragon, and so on all the way down the list, making sure our final if statement has an unknown return for all those cases where some new type is added and we don't know how to handle it. Of course, you've got to remember to add about 1,000 close brackets here, knowing that Excel will shout at you if you get it wrong, but this will work. It does the job. If you want to make it a bit slicker though, perhaps try the switch statement. Switch takes which value you're comparing against, in our case type, but it only needs to be fed it for one time. Then, in pairs, you simply specify what it might be and what the return for that match is. So, bug, grass, dragon, dragon, and so on. For me, this is a lot simpler, and you can even specify a default return value at the bottom as your final entry, in our case unknown. I think this is a lot neater than those nested ifs, and you can even format it within the formula bar to match this layout here, by pressing Alt and Enter to start a new line if that's what you want to do. The eagle-eyed amongst you may have already clocked there's another way to do this with the data here, and that's using XLookup. For example, we could look up the type within the reference table to the right, returning from the second column from that reference table, and specifying unknown for what to do if no match is found. I think this would be my preferred approach to this particular case because we have this reference table here, but Switch doesn't need a reference table, so sometimes it is the easier thing to use. So it's completely up to you whether you prefer Switch or XLookup for this kind of task. However, Switch won't cut it for our next calculation with the figure calculation, and you might start to see why as we build up our nested if approach to this solution. With the nested if statements, we simply compare the HP against each of the grain boundaries in turn, knowing that if that one is true, we know which category it's in. Again, there's nothing wrong with this kind of approach, but if you want to tighten up a bit, go for XLookup. You can use Switch in this case if you really want to, but it will take quite a lot of tweaking, so XLookup for me is way simpler. To do this, we would simply look up the HP value within the first column in our reference table and return from the second column in our reference table. Because it won't match exactly, we can go to the second optional argument by leaving that first optional argument blank and specify -1 as our match mode. This tells XLookup that if we don't find a match, match on the next smallest thing that is in the table. If this is a little bit confusing for you, go check out my XLookup series where I cover all of this in depth in video 2. I think this is a lot neater than those nested if statements and has the benefit that if you want to add in new boundaries, you just have to edit this table and the references accordingly. You don't have to work out where exactly within your series of nested ifs it needs to slot in. Finally, we have the battle form calculation. For this calculation, we are doing multiple different comparisons for each step, so it doesn't make sense to use switch or XLookup here, not unless you wanted to calculate some sort of helper column first. The nested if statement is reasonably predictable. You just have if and the condition you want, and then which Pokemon it is, and then as before, just nest them all the way down. Here we're comparing speed, attack and defense against particular boundaries until we have all 8 categories that we can match with a different Pokemon type for each. For example, a Pokemon that is slow but has high attack and defense would fight like Snorlax, whereas one that is slow and weak but has a high defense would attack like a Metapod. Where you need to do multiple comparisons on multiple criteria, particularly where those criteria are asymmetric, the if statement is your best friend. For ifs, you simply specify a condition and then the return result, and then the next condition and the next return result. This may, on the face of it, not be a lot neater than nested if statements, but as it is just one function, it is a lot easier to read and a lot easier to add to later on. Just bear in mind, though, that it does work these out just like the nested if statements, starting with the first and moving through, so if something matches the first one and the fifth one, it will only return the result for the first one. When it comes down to it, all 3 of these are great alternatives to nested if statements, and each has their own particular use cases. Switch is great when you're comparing a particular value against things you know it might be. XLookup is great for comparing things where they might be in a range, because you can use that match mode. And the ifs are great when you've got multiple conditions or multiple criteria to compare against, particularly when those conditions are being compared asymmetrically. For me, it's really important that my formulas are easy to understand, whether that is because I'm handing off to a colleague, coming back to it in a few weeks, or because I'm doing something like Excel esports, where I need to be able to quickly see where something's gone wrong if I need to make a change. This means that these alternatives to nested if statements will win me over every time. I really recommend that you give these a go and see how powerful they are. And if you start replacing nested if statements in your work with one of these approaches, I would love to hear about it in the comments. That's all for now though, so make sure you join me next time, and until then, keep excelling.